Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and on behalf of the leadership team at America at a Crossroads, I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's program. Our leadership team includes former Congressman Mel Levine and former Los Angeles County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky. Before we begin tonight's program, we pause to remember the events of September 11th, 2001. 24 years ago today, it was a day of unimaginable loss when nearly 3,000 people were taken, lives were taken in New York, Washington, and Pennsylvania. We honor the memory of those who perished, the courage of the first responders who rushed towards the scene, some of whom paid with their lives. We also honor the resilience of the families, survivors, and communities who have carried the weight of that day ever since. As we reflect together, we recognize not only the sorrow of that moment, but also the strength and unity that arose from it. In memory of those who lost their lives, we must resolve to remain committed to upholding and protecting the values that bind us as a nation, our freedom, our democracy, and our shared humanity. Thank you and welcome back to tonight's guest, the editor-in-chief of Israel's oldest newspaper, Haaretz. His name is Aluf Benn. We welcome as well to Warren Olney, our moderator tonight. We really appreciate both of you being with us. I mentioned last week that we have two September programs which more or less coincide with the 30th anniversary of the Oslo Accords, as well as other very important and exciting programs in September. Tonight is the first of the two programs in September relating to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The second is being produced by the UCLA Center for Israel Studies, the UC Berkeley Diller Institute for Israel Studies, together with America at a Crossroads as a co-sponsor. That program is on September 30th and will feature the former Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Olmert, and the former Foreign Minister of the PA, Nasser al-Kidwa. And it will be about 30 years since Oslo. Why did the Accords fail? And can Israeli-Palestinian peace process be salvaged? So we hope that you'll join us. Please try to register for that. That program is in the morning because of the obvious time difference between the Middle East and LA. I think it's 10 to 11:30, but we'd love for you to register and join us if you can. Next Wednesday, we will welcome once again David Frum in conversation with Pat Morrison on the topic America's Democracy. Where do we go from here? The following week, we have the new Chancellor of UCLA, Julio Frank, in conversation with Larry Mantle. Can American universities survive the current assault? And we think that'll be an outstanding program as well. I also want to remind you that we have an immigration-related program on October 9th that's being co-sponsored by a whole panoply of Latino and Jewish organizations. The moderator will be Jonathan Blitzer of The New Yorker, and we have a whole panel, one of whom is the former Secretary of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas. We hope that you'll register for all these programs in advance. They're all on the email that you'll get after the program tonight. Now, without further ado, please welcome tonight's moderator, Warren Olney. He has spent his life reporting, anchoring, moderating, and producing news for both television and radio. And now for us, he's one of our regular moderators at America at a Crossroads. Warren, the show is yours, and we are very grateful to you for being part of our team.
Janice, thank you so much. I'm just delighted to be here. And thank you for what you said about September 11th. As somebody said at the time, it created a hole in the world, and I think that hole still exists today. As you said, our guest today is Aluf Benn. He is the longtime editor-in-chief of Haaretz. That's the oldest newspaper in Israel, founded in 1919, a long time before Israel itself became a state. Haaretz reports, analyzes the news from a liberal and a progressive point of view. And Aluf Benn, you've been here before. Thank you so much for being back on America at a Crossroads.
Thank you.
The UN Security Council today issued a unanimous resolution with a joint statement condemning this week's strikes in Doha, the capital of Qatar. The resolution was signed by the United States. One of the interesting things was that although the strikes were committed by Israel, Israel was not named in the resolution. What do you make of that? Why do you think that happened?
Well, I think that was the precondition by the Trump administration to join the consensus and not veto it, because it reads very bizarre, as if aliens attacked Doha and not Israel. But I guess it was important to have the United States on board, so they had to compromise on the language.
A lot of strong talk by all the members of the committee. There's the commission rather. There's a lot of stuff coming up in the UN very soon having to do with Pakistan. What do you anticipate?
Well, we have the event sponsored by initiated by President Macron of France to recognize Palestine as a state. And he was joined by the United Kingdom and Australia and Canada and some other governments. Clearly, it's not going to change anything on the ground. It's not going to stop the war. It's not going to stop the expansion of settlements in the West Bank. It's not going to oust the Netanyahu government. It is, though, a symbolic move to show that the idea of the two-state solution or the two-state idea is still alive, however badly, and it needs life support, and that was what Macron was trying to do. And it embarrassed the Israeli government. How do I know? Because they made a lot of effort to derail it, and realizing that they cannot have any direct influence on these European governments or on Australia or Canada, they convinced the Trump administration to deny visas to Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, the president of the Palestinian Authority, and his team, so they could not attend the ceremony at the United Nations. And to show that, as you know, they could be recognized as much as they want, but it has nothing to do with real life. And then Macron wanted to come to Israel, and the Israeli government told him that if he wants to land in Ben Gurion, he needs to rescind to withdraw from his recognition of Palestine, which he wouldn't do, obviously.
Let's talk a little bit more about what you might describe as real life. Excuse me, sorry.
Just one thing.
Yeah.
The interesting thing about Macron's initiative to come to Israel was that, bear in mind that the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, is under an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court for war crimes and crimes against humanity. And if he lands in Paris, Macron's government is supposed to arrest him. And that's why Netanyahu does not set foot in any of the ICC member states for a long time. And when he flies to the United States, as he will next week to the United Nations General Assembly, he flies only above American bases. So if he needs some emergency landing, he could be rest assured in American hands. And Macron was willing to come to Israel to talk to him, which is to Netanyahu a kind of diplomatic coup. And then saying no to Macron makes you like stronger to your base at home.
Obviously, the United States is not a member of the International Criminal Court, which is why Netanyahu can make that difference, can make that decision. Let's talk a little bit more about the attacks that occurred earlier this week. One of the questions you're asking today in Haaretz is, did the attack succeed? I think a lot of the way you answer that is to first of all figure out what was the goal of the attack.
Well, I think the immediate goal was to kill the leadership or some of the leaders of Hamas, of what we call the external Hamas, the Hamas abroad, who reside in Qatar. And if you remember, Israel assassinated Ismail Haniyeh, was the head of the external Hamas, and in Tehran last year. At that time, or until the recent attack, Israel refrained from attacking Qatar. Not because it's an ally, but because Qatar has a very complicated relationship with Israel and with Hamas and with the United States and Iran, and it plays each and every power in the region and outside against each other. Netanyahu has been embarrassed by his ties to Qatar in two levels. One, that he sponsored the Qatari payments to Hamas before the war. Since 2018, when the Palestinian Authority withdrew from paying salaries to the government structure in Gaza, Qatar stepped in its place and started giving Hamas tens of millions of dollars every month, at first in cash, then in bank transfers. And now we know that a lot of that money was used for military buildup and for preparing the eventual attack on Israel on October 7th. And Netanyahu, who was a big supporter of this Qatari move, arguing that in his effort to prevent a Palestinian state, the division between Hamas in Gaza and the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah was crucial for his success of his policy. So keeping Hamas on kind of life support while fighting it, on the other hand, was central to Netanyahu's status quo policy. So he's been embarrassed by that since the war, since October 7th. And the second thing is that several of Netanyahu's closest aides were dealing with his PR machine, are under investigation for being paid to run PR campaigns for the Qatari government, even though by through front companies and so on. And so are several former senior officials in the Israeli intelligence. And this is called Qatargate in Israel, and it's the most embarrassing probe to Netanyahu's inner circle to this day. And he's been standing by his aides rather than trying to distance himself. He said he didn't know, but Qatar was not an enemy state. So by attacking Qatar, he can tell people in Israel, you see, I'm not a stooge of Qatar. I'm not, there have been a lot of conspiracy theories about Netanyahu being bribed by Qatar. And some documents detailing transfers of tens of millions of dollars from Qatar to Netanyahu's campaigns. We found no evidence that these documents were real, but they did fuel conspiracy theories against Netanyahu in Israel. So you see, I'm not a stooge of Qatar. I'm bombing Qatar. That's one
On the
thing.
other hand,
The other
but
thing,
negotiations were going on for a resolution that was presented by the United States and by Netanyahu.
which resolution?
Isn't that true? A peace proposal or a ceasefire proposal is what
Yeah,
was being debated in Qatar by
yeah,
Hamas and the people from Qatar. It
yeah.
was presented by Netanyahu and Trump.
Well, Netanyahu from day one did not want a comprehensive deal to end the war and exchange Israeli hostages with Palestinian prisoners. And he wanted, and he still wants, to prolong the war for several reasons. First of all, it's good for him politically because it delays any talk of election, it keeps his coalition together. But that's the easy thing. Strategically, what he's trying to achieve is the destruction of Gaza and an effort to push its inhabitants to relocate the Palestinians in Gaza, to expel them to third countries voluntarily, what they call voluntary immigration. And Netanyahu's government has been in talks with several countries like South Sudan and Indonesia and some others in order to, maybe Ethiopia as well, in order to drive out, so convince them to accept hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from Gaza, so far unsuccessfully. But as long as the war is going on, Israel is going city after city in Gaza, driving out the population, raising all the buildings and infrastructure and roads and community services, etc. And now the big goal is Gaza City, the largest city in Gaza, home to about 1 million people who still live there under horrible conditions. And Netanyahu didn't want to end the war, and he doesn't want to release all these Palestinian prisoners. So for a long time, he supported a partial deal to bring back 10 out of the 20 living hostages and some of the dead hostages as well, and keep the war going after some impasse of 60 days or so. And then when the Hamas indicated that they were willing to accept it, he changed his mind and asked for a comprehensive deal, which Hamas preconditions with full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. And the fact that Hamas is still there running whatever show there is in Gaza and still holding these hostages allows Netanyahu to keep fighting. Although the IDF, which succeeded brilliantly against Hezbollah and against Iran, so far has failed to defeat Hamas. And although they killed tens of thousands of people, they killed thousands and thousands of Hamas operatives, they killed the leadership of Hamas, both in Gaza and some of the leadership abroad. So far to no avail. Hamas is still holding the hostages and still in whatever power there is, the distribution of food or whatever in Gaza.
President Trump has said today that he's very unhappy about the strikes. What role do you think he played? There's been a lot of conflicting reports about whether he was told in advance or whether he told Netanyahu not to do it in advance. And that seems there's a lot of uncertainty about that.
The official American version is that the American radars or, air traffic control systems discovered the Israeli warplanes on the way to attack, and then they told Trump, and then Netanyahu or the Israeli government told the American government, and they warned the Qataris, but it came too late to stop it. And I'm not sure if that was the case or that there was prior knowledge, because about a week before, or less than a week before, the Israeli chief of staff, Eyal Zamir, who later it was published that he opposed the strike at this stage, like all the rest of the Israeli intelligence and military chiefs. General Zamir warned the Hamas leaders outside of Israel that Israel was out to get them. And the Qataris listened to that and asked the United States to get some kind of Israeli commitment not to attack Qatar, which apparently was given, but not truthfully. What they did, to the best of my knowledge, was not to attack in Qatar, but from hundreds of miles away by long-range missiles. But it doesn't matter. And Qatar, after threatening to respond and trying to convince other Gulf countries to reduce their ties with Israel, I just see that the Prime Minister of Qatar was the chief mediator, negotiator for hostage/ceasefire deal, said at the United Nations that despite what happened, Qatar would still be the mediator. So from that standpoint, Israel enjoyed the best of everything. It bombed Qatar and got away with it. But the bombing failed because apparently the key Hamas leaders survived. I don't know if they're healthy and can walk. So far, we haven't seen them on television. And the main leader, Khalil al-Khia, was not attending the funerals of the others who were killed, or his son and some low-level operatives. But clearly, it was seen in Israel and the opposition by the opposition as an effort to derail and assassinate not just Hamas but the coming deal. The hostage families were especially very much worried and critical about it, and it's just another stage of escalation that you extend the war to another front. And that's coupled with the escalation in Gaza itself, where it's calling the reserves and sending them or sending other troops to occupy Gaza City and destroy it. So what we see is escalation and not ceasefire.
Back to Qatar and the United States. The United States has an enormous military base in Qatar. It's an ally of this country. And there's a lot of financial dealing between the United States and Qatar as well.
They gave the president his aircraft.
Is there some thought that
Biggest gift ever.
That's why President Trump is unhappy?
Well, they didn't hit his plane on the American base, but clearly you cannot do anything in the Middle East without the Americans seeing it in advance. But I don't think it was coordinated. But there is speculation that the warning did come in time for the Hamas leaders to hide, and that's why they were not caught. But I'm not sure.
So, what about the negotiations to release hostages, and how will this affect that?
Well, clearly it's not. It shows that Israel is not really honest in its negotiations, that it wants to prolong the war. And if the Israeli far right in the Israeli coalition, its leaders are saying openly that there's no point in prisoner exchange or releasing the hostages, and to them the hostages just happen to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. And if the price of their release is the release of the worst terrorists from Israeli prisons, or to withdraw from territory in Gaza that these people want to occupy and to integrate into Israel and to build Jewish settlements there. So, and they have enormous influence on Netanyahu. But even Netanyahu recently speaks less and less about hostages. And most of the time he's not appearing in public or not giving interviews to the Israeli media, only mostly to American right-wing podcasters. To him, the important base is on Pennsylvania Avenue, and that's where he gets his freedom of action or lack thereof from President Trump, and that's what he's trying to affect. And Trump, unlike Netanyahu, frames the war as an effort to bring back the hostages. So in other words, it appears as if Netanyahu convinced Trump that the real effort, the real goal of the war is to release the hostages, but that's not how it appears seen in Israel.
So international affairs have gotten pretty cynical, it would seem to me.
Yes, definitely. When you're attacking the other side during the negotiation, it's not as if you come to negotiate bona fide.
What about the attack to the alleged plan to clear Gaza out and the order or request that people leave, as you indicated, a voluntary immigration, supported, of course, by President Trump here in this country, is what ought to happen. How likely is that? And how likely is the attack by Israel, whether Palestinians leave or not?
Well, you call it voluntary immigration when you bomb people and destroy their homes and not give them any hope to ever rebuild their lives in that place. It's not
Voluntary deportation, I should
voluntary.
say. Yeah.
Not really voluntary.
Yeah.
But I believe that what Netanyahu is trying to do is to wait out until some governments in the West or elsewhere would be willing to accept Palestinian refugees in the same way that they accepted refugees from Syria or from Ukraine or Russians who escaped Putin's war, etc., etc. So far, the idea that they need to be there and that the solution should be some resurrection of Palestinian entity in Gaza is still the official policy of most governments in the world, and they're not really open to accept Palestinian refugees. But over time, they might change their mind, and I think this is what Netanyahu and his political allies are building on. And not only that, I believe that this idea, we might call it ethnic cleansing, and we might call it a war crime, but it's very popular among Israeli Jews, even among those who would not support Netanyahu and would never vote for Netanyahu. If you could just have the Palestinians in Gaza disappear or many of them go away, it appears to be a victory for Israel. And I saw polling data that 2/3 of Israeli Jews support this idea. So even if you discount half of them, the half that supports Netanyahu, it means there's half of the other half supports that too. Is it feasible? I'm not sure, but clearly that's what they're trying to achieve. If you look at what Israel has been doing, not just statements by Netanyahu or Trump about the Riviera in Gaza and the resort and all that, you see a progress, city after city, neighborhood after neighborhood, of the total destruction and driving out the inhabitants towards tent cities and shanty towns in a smaller and smaller territory, which I think now is about 1/6 of the entire Gaza Strip territory, which wasn't big to begin with. It was the most dense area, maybe not in the world, but definitely in the Middle East, even before the war.
Is this idea of having a Riviera in Gaza something that is being seriously considered? Are there plans to build it? Designs being constructed? Is it moving forward?
Well, we know. Well, so far it's not being constructed, but I saw a document that was spread by the White House in the Washington Post the other week, which laid out a plan to build high-tech AI towers and residential towers in Gaza and so on. Look, there are tens of millions of tons of rubble in Gaza. To rebuild it would take enormous effort, enormous financial resources, and leadership. And if you want Hamas out, there's vacuum. And Netanyahu opposes the giving it back to the Palestinian Authority, which in any event is very weak, even in the West Bank where it has some control, and it would be very difficult for it to run Gaza. So they talk about some sort of pan-Arab consortium with Egypt and the Emiratis and the Saudis and so on, funding it and maybe policing it. But so far, there's been no effort to launch an initiative like that, and the Israeli government opposes anything. It still wants to keep the war going and what they call to defeat Hamas, to eliminate Hamas, to drive out Hamas, no matter how you want to call it.
Could Mr. Netanyahu put a stop to this whole situation if he wanted to?
Of course. Look, he might get into political trouble. His far-right coalition partners might threaten to leave the coalition and bring down the government, which would lead to early election in the spring or in, I don't know, March, February, April, rather than the official date in November next year. It's not that much of a difference. And again, we have a debate in Israel, even within the pages of Haaretz, whether Netanyahu surrenders to his far-right coalition partners and he is somehow more moderate or more willing to listen to international concerns, etc., or there's no real difference, that he shares the same ideas, and even if in the past he was not messianic or Kahanist, he joined that camp, and there is no real difference in policy, just in talking. For example, Finance Minister Smotrich laid out his plan to annex 82% of the West Bank and encircle the Palestinian towns there with Israeli-controlled areas and Jewish settlements. And when this was published, the Emiratis threatened to call back the Abraham Accords, and the Saudis indicated that there would be no normalization with Israel with annexation. So Netanyahu called off a cabinet session that was supposed to deal with that. But it's a very popular idea, what they call sovereignty, and we call annexation, is a very popular idea among the right-wing base in Israel. So Netanyahu's opposition might be tactical. But if he decides to stop the war, there would probably be an early election, and it would be blamed for stopping the war and not winning it. Even if the hostages are back. If Hamas stays in power, then why did you take all this risk? Netanyahu's counter-argument would be that first, Israel defeated Hezbollah in Iran, its main enemies and main threats. And also, I believe that he sees himself as the expander of Israeli territory after 5 decades since the Yom Kippur War in 1973 of withdrawals. Israel now occupies new territory in Syria, new territory in Lebanon, and new territory in Gaza. Once again, so to him, it's like building a greater Israel with greater regional influence. But most people don't care about it. And those who oppose Netanyahu opposed him before the war, during the war, before bombing Iran, after bombing Iran. Those who support Netanyahu supported him before the war, after October 7, and since. It has nothing to do with what's happening. The political camps and bases in Israel have nothing to do with what's happening on the ground, or in the war, or in the air, or in the missile sphere.
The question we put forward to identify this program was, is there still a chance for a Palestinian state and the two-state solution. Do you A, support that, and do you B, think it's conceivable at this point?
Well, I supported that idea. I've supported that idea for many years, and I still think that it's the most viable option for more peaceful coexistence, which is really the goal here. I don't expect the Palestinians to accept Zionist ideas, and I don't expect Israeli Jews to accept to be the followers of Yasser Arafat. A two-state solution was supposed to be some sort of compromise between these two national movements that don't really leave room for each other. So far, it failed to mature, and the Oslo Accords walked some way towards it by building the Palestinian autonomy in the West Bank and Gaza, but it wasn't enough to go all the way. And 25 years ago, I remember covering the Camp David peace conference when President Clinton tried to reach that accord with Arafat and Ehud Barak and failed. And then there was a later effort by President Bush with Prime Minister Olmert, is still the main believer of this in the Israeli political scene. You mentioned before that he's going to appear on this stage with his Palestinian counterpart Nasser al-Kidwa. I interviewed both of them at our conference in London last year, and they're going to appear again in another conference of ours. I think that's still a good idea. And what the Israeli government is worried about it, the right-wing government, and that's why they're trying to deny the Palestinians both the territory through expanding settlements in the West Bank, through expelling small Palestinian communities from areas like Area C, which is area in the West Bank under Israeli control. That's why they're trying to occupy Gaza and drive out its inhabitants. So to deny the Palestinians both the territory and the population. Clearly, for Netanyahu, his main effort, there's a big debate whether Netanyahu has an ideology or not. And I believe that throughout his career, he worked ceaselessly towards one end, and that was to prevent the partition of the land and the creation of a Palestinian state. And whenever he had a choice, only once he accepted the idea, heavily preconditioned under Obama's pressures in 2009. But besides that, he worked tirelessly to prevent it, and he still does. And on that, there is no real distinction between him and the far right. It's only that he is more attentive to diplomacy and so on. But
So
is
what
it
about
possible?
Israel?
Is it possible? Of course it is. The idea that you cannot change the settlement map or remove them, or that you cannot reach some deal to leave some of them, I believe it's possible. But it's difficult, and it demands a real change of heart in Israel. Clearly, the October 7 attacks have not made it easier, because many Israeli Jews believe that, left to their own devices, the Palestinians would do another October 7 and another and another. And there's lack of trust, but you need to build it. And still, I don't see a better alternative than partition and coexistence. We could see that even throughout the war, the Palestinian Authority and Israel, and despite their diplomatic fighting all over the world, their security cooperation remains intact in the West Bank. And there was no intifada or uprising or an effort to join the Gaza war by the West Bank Palestinians. So coexistence is possible, but it's difficult to achieve.
You said earlier that even people who would vote against Netanyahu if they had the chance would like to see the Palestinians removed from Gaza. That's a pretty confusing situation. How do Israelis in general feel about what's going on now, and what's the state of the electorate?
Well, the Netanyahu base would like to keep the war going until some sort of the ultimate victory that is still evading them, and the others would like to see it over and the hostages back. But they're divided between those who would like to see the hostages back and then resuming the war against Hamas, and the others who just want to call it quits and reach some sort of ceasefire and hope that it survives the test of time. One of the amazing facts of this war was the resilience of the Israeli economy. We have the shekel is one of the strongest currencies in the world. The Tel Aviv Stock Exchange, I mean, before the Oracle surprise this week, was the strongest in the world last year. Unemployment is very low, which is contrary to what happened in previous wars. For example, during the Second Intifada and the suicide bombings in 2000 through 2005, there was huge unemployment. The shekel was devalued. There were a lot of streamlining measures to save the economy. We don't see it now. So people who live away from Gaza in Tel Aviv or in its suburbs, to us, if you go out, it's like the pre-war situation. The beaches are full, restaurants are full, less tourists, but you see people all over the place, which wasn't the case at the beginning of the war. You could see many people coming back from reserve duty with the rifles, or there were many sirens going off. Now we have about every other day or so a missile fired by the Houthis from Yemen, usually intercepted harmlessly, and people live with that. So the main burden of the war is felt by tens of thousands of reservists who are now recalled once again for 200 or 300 a day in the past 2 years, which is a lot. It affects their families, their businesses, but it does not translate into a protest movement to end the war. And the protest in Israel, to the extent it exists, the anti-government protest is focused on bring back the hostages, bring them home now, and not on stop the war. There is a small left-wing minority movement that calls to stop the war for moral reasons, but it doesn't have a huge following. Unfortunately.
It's time, I think, to go to the audience and allow the people who have been listening to you and watching us ask questions. It's my favorite part of the program, quite frankly. And here's one that we're getting that I think more than one person has asked about, if I can get back to it. Is an international boycott of Israel by a large number of countries likely, do you think? And if so, would the threat of a boycott make a difference in Israel's decision regarding its presence in Gaza or in the West Bank? That's from Jack of Santa Barbara.
Well, we see boycott moves. Like every day we have a story about, another letter by thousands of Hollywood people, or, a city in Belgium refusing a concert by the Munich Orchestra because its conductor is Israeli, Lav Shani. We saw protest against Israeli riders in Volta in the Spanish bicycle race, etc., etc. So we see it happening. It's so far not translated, with the exception of Turkey, into a total ban on trade with Israel or denying entry to Israelis, etc. My fear is, and I think that as long as the Trump administration is giving Israel such backing, these measures are not going to escalate so quickly. My fear is that if Israel is under boycott, rather than forcing it out of Gaza, it would just focus the government attention on a crackdown on democracy and freedom of speech, because we saw it happening in other places that were under sanctions. The first thing they do is to crack down on dissent, rather than just say, okay, the world doesn't want us to be in Gaza or in Ukraine, or Iran has been under sanctions for decades, and it's just fueling their internal crackdown. And so my fear is that, at least in the short term, it would strengthen the autocratic tendencies of the Netanyahu government, rather than just change its heart. Clearly, the dependence on the United States and on the support by Trump is crucial. But let me remind you that the Biden administration, even though Netanyahu is now trying to portray Biden as his adversary, who denied Israel its victory, we know that it wasn't true. And the Biden administration supported Israel just as much as Trump does, with very minor embargoes of certain weapon systems that made no effect or change during the war. I'm not sure whether Biden would have sent the B-2s to bomb Iran in the way Trump did, but I'm not sure that he wouldn't either. Other than that, he gave Israel carte blanche support at the Security Council. Uh, I don't remember any Arab-Israeli war in the past where the Security Council for 2 years, I mean, there was not such a long war anyway, but for 2 years, the Security Council did not try to stop it or call a ceasefire, totally deterred by the American veto. And as you mentioned at the beginning, even naming Israel as the aggressor against Qatar was denied.
Robert Alschuler wants to know this. It seems that the world sees Benjamin Netanyahu as a war criminal likened to Putin, especially since he has recently bombed Qatar. Why can't the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, constrain him?
Because he has a majority in the parliamentary system. If you have a majority coalition, even in a multi-party system like Israel's, then the Knesset is just it's a rubber stamp. And for example, on the bombing of Qatar, Yair Lapid, the former short-lived prime minister and leader of the opposition, even when the planes were on the way back, he immediately applauded the operation, obviously applauding the military and our brave pilots and intelligence officers, and not Netanyahu. But still, I would say the mainstream opposition supports the war. They don't want it to end just before Hamas is defeated. So the Knesset is just a tool in the hands of Netanyahu.
Here's Jeff.
What he's trying to achieve and what he's been trying to achieve since returning to power almost 3 years ago is the destruction and the erosion of any checks and balances that exist in the Israeli system, like the independent civil service, the Attorney General, the Supreme Court, a strong position or strong influence of the military and intelligence community over policymaking. That has been his effort, and after some impasse at the beginning of the war, he returned to that full speed.
Victor wants to know, Israel has lost a lot of its own soldiers in this war. How is the Israeli population tolerating that?
Israel lost 904 soldiers to this day since October 7, along with about 1,200 civilians that were killed on October 7 itself and somewhat ever since in terrorist attacks. Look, in the past, the fear of military casualties, at least since the first Lebanon war in the early 1980s, was a very important driving force in Israeli policy. And the one leader who was mostly identified with it was none other than Netanyahu, who was a bereaved, he was a bereaved brother. He comes from a bereaved family. And when you read his memoirs, it's all about bereavement and how he's trying to avoid it. And clearly the attack on Gaza entails the risk of Hamas guerrilla warfare. And last week we lost 4 soldiers whose tank was attacked. And the chief of staff who opposed that operation in Gaza, the operation of Gaza City, called it a death trap. But then he saluted and went on performing it. I do give him the credit to General Zamir that he's very careful to save or to protect the soldiers' lives. And the number of casualties in Gaza is much less than the pre-war expectations. But still, it's a major issue. And if it goes on and and unfortunately we see more casualties, it might affect public opinion as well. But so far it failed to resonate in terms of protest or change of heart in the government.
Is there any indication that the senior military leadership is concerned about what's been happening in Gaza, the reputation that soldiers are getting for attacking people who aren't able to protect themselves? And are there any morale issues in the military?
There are. There have been more cases of suicide among soldiers, both conscript and reservists. And the level of reporting to the reserve units is very low. compared to the beginning of the war when everybody was willing to enlist and even volunteer just to go and fight Hamas after October 7. It's less so because many people feel that it's getting nowhere and they're just risking their lives for nothing. The military is trying to conceal it through different bureaucratic measures and showing different statistics of reporting to the reserve units. There's been cases of small-time mutinies among the regular units as well, with soldiers refusing to go into Gaza. But so far, the military has been able to live with it and to keep fighting. Clearly, there are moral issues, and according to our correspondents who visit the units in Gaza, uh, there's a lot of disorganized, uh, lack of discipline, and other problems like friendly fire incidents. A lot of people operating bulldozers to raise Gaza with semi-authority civilians from mostly settlers from the West Bank coming to Gaza to take part in its destruction. It's not the most organized force or disciplined force in the world. But that's been the characteristically of the Israeli army since its inception, even from before the state.
Several people have asked a version of this question. Some feel that the way Israel has prosecuted this war has resulted in Israel losing its moral claims, justification, and foundation as a Jewish state. The polls show that young American Jews and many not so young Jews no longer support Israel. How is Israel going to come out of this mess and regain the support of American Jews?
I think it's a very big question. But the thing is that the forces that are now in power in Israel reject liberalism and definitely progressivism that I think are much more prevalent among young and even older American Jews. It would be very difficult to turn it back. But the way it's handled in Israel is, first of all, bear in mind that mainstream Israeli media does not report from Gaza. We are almost the only ones who do that. And to the extent that mainstream Israelis are exposed to what's happening in Gaza, it's through the lens of, the Israeli media quoting foreign media reports, doubting their doubting that they're true at all, and framing it as kind of anti-Semitism in the Western media against Israel, that they just don't get it, that Israel cannot defend itself by the rules of war because they are not meant against enemies like Hamas, and so they simply overlook it, or they see President Trump supporting Israel, and they care less about what's happening in the grassroots, or framing it as hopeless cases of anti-Semitism that is now more legitimized because of the Gaza war. Um, I don't think that and the more liberal classes in Israel, uh, some of them emigrated and escaped the war to be in I don't know, in Portugal or Sri Lanka or Thailand or Berlin or Paris or London or the United States or Canada. And the other just hope for it to be over and for the Netanyahu regime to be over and then try to rebuild Israel from that. But what we're seeing is a less liberal country, and that began before October 7th.
Susan is asking this. Do you think that Bibi Netanyahu would go to prison if his government folded?
I don't think he will go to prison because his corruption trial, has been dragging on for 5 years. And it would take at least a year, even if they're able to run it for run his testimony for 3-4 times a week, as they now say. It would take at least a year or two to conclude that at the district court level, and then you would have an appeal by either side on whatever verdict there would be. There might be an appeal, so that would take a couple of more years. The idea that Netanyahu would be convicted and sent to prison when he's, I don't know, 79 or 80 years old is beyond belief. And there's always the possibility of a plea bargain, which so far both the prosecution and Netanyahu rejected. There's a possibility with the current Attorney General who insists on prosecuting that trial. He leaves office, or the government is eventually successful in firing her. Any successor would just call off the trial. Or there's also the probability of a pardon from President Herzog, who's been an ally of was an opponent, but then became a strong ally of Netanyahu, and he can just give him the out of prison ticket. So far, the Netanyahu has used the trial to solidify his base around him and to justify his effort to destroy the independence of the Israeli justice and legal system. So he's having the time of his life testifying in his own trial, because politically he spun it in his favor in a very twisted way. It's not like the Bolsonaro trial in Brazil was now sent to 27 years in prison.
Douglas wants to know, what is the status of the new requirement that all Israeli adults, including the Orthodox, serve in the army?
Well, that's the hottest political potato for the Netanyahu coalition, because it tears it apart. It drives a wedge between its two religious components. The ultra-Orthodox, who are larger in number, but are not conscripted, and the modern Orthodox in American parlance, the National Orthodox, as we call them in Israel, who are represented in the combat units. They're very much into going to career military and to fight in the front line. And obviously then among the numbers of casualties and wounded and so on. So far, the idea that to keep the right wing in power, you must bribe the ultra-Orthodox by keeping their kids away from the army, prevailed over the injustice built into that system. And given the fact that this is the fastest growing community in Israel in terms of natural growth and very little immigration out of Israel, the military needs these numbers. And they issued tens of thousands of draft warrants to the ultra-Orthodox, threatened them with arrest. But Netanyahu never really justified that policy. Sees it as a political inconvenience, but necessity. And so far, very little has been done to really draft the ultra-Orthodox. Although the military changed its mind, for many years, the military didn't want these kids because they come with the price tag of a very Orthodox lifestyle in the barracks, like driving out female soldiers out of sight, extreme kosher demands, and so on. They changed their mind since October 7 because they really want and need more soldiers. So far, very little progress was made on that. And the opposition, former Prime Minister Bennett, who tried to position himself as the main opponent of Netanyahu in the coming election, his main flag that is raised is the alliance of those who serve. But the opposition so far has failed to unite itself, or the Jewish opposition, Zionist opposition, the Knesset, to unite itself around the draft. Maybe they still believe that the ultra-Orthodox one day might come back to alliance with them.
Panina wants to know, why does the government keep resisting Syria's plans to distribute adequate food for Gazan civilians?
Well, they did expand, well, after the news of starvation dominated the news cycle in the West, and President Trump demanded more aid into Gaza, Israel lifted some of its restrictions. So there is more food and medicine and so on in Gaza these days than there was 2 months ago. There are still death cases from malnutrition because these things take a while to overcome, and also the distribution is not as effective. But there is more food going into Gaza. And that's why the starvation more or less disappeared from the news cycle in recent weeks. It's less of a problem. But there are still dozens of Gazans killed every day in Israeli bombings. And the Israeli army and government, they don't even justify it. In most cases, they don't even explain why this or that position or person or house or whatever was attacked. They destroyed several high-rise buildings in Gaza and boasted about it and argued that these buildings somehow belong to Hamas without showing any evidence. And this goes on day after day after day after day.
Here's a citation from Yossi Klein Halevi. One of our listeners says he recently wrote about the lack of empathy that Israelis feel for the Gazan suffering, both in terms of the number of Gazans killed and in terms of food shortages. He put it in terms of a moral crisis for Jews. How do you see that?
Well, as I said, first of all, it's barely reported in Israel. And I think that the mainstream feeling about it is that they deserve it. They had it coming. They attacked us on October 7 mercilessly. They raped and looted and killed civilians and burned their homes, etc., etc. And therefore, they deserve whatever punishment they're getting. And there's no real, very few Israeli Jews have any moral respect for what's happening in Gaza. And as I said, we're the only ones who even report that or call people. And we don't have reporters in Gaza, obviously. The entry is denied even to foreign media, but we call people in Gaza. We have videos from Gaza. We're the only ones who do that. So when you ask about a moral crisis, most Israeli Jews don't feel it. And the Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel do, but their protests from the beginning of the war was very much monitored and limited by the government, by the police, by the legal system. So you don't hear it so much. But there is obliviousness and ignorance of what's happening in Gaza, and it's rooted back by, Israeli Jews are also ignorant of the Nakba of 1948 of the Palestinians. So it's not something that was invented after October 7, but it was justified by October 7.
Mina says, all this sounds terrible. What gives you hope?
We always believe in change. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to do what we're doing. But I'm not trying to portray a rosy picture of what's happening in the war. And I hope that it would end sooner rather than later, that we have the hostages back home, the surviving ones, the dead ones brought to a funeral, and to reach some sort of better coexistence with the Palestinians. That's what we're working for. But it's a hard sell today in Israel. I acknowledge that.
And it'll continue to be a hard sell, even if Netanyahu leaves or is diselected.
Well, I believe that it's not a walk in the park, but he has a chance to win another election because the other side is so fractured, lacking a vision, lacking a leader, and lacking a counter idea. And Netanyahu is also a much better political trickster than his opponents. He might lose, but it's going to take a while to change course because even if he loses, the right wing would be dominant in Israeli society for the foreseeable future, both demographically and also because Naftali Bennett, who's the supposed opponent of Netanyahu, is also from the right wing. In the past, he outflanked Netanyahu. He was the Ben Gvir and Smotrich of the previous coalitions, outflanking Netanyahu from the right. He reached out to the center and left, and even to an Arab party in his own coalition. So he's different than Netanyahu in his openness, but he's a right-winger. He has no support at all for a Palestinian state or for giving Palestinians any rights or anything like that.
Aluf, Ben, it's been extraordinary to talk with you, and thank you so much for your openness and candor and the detailed understanding of what's going on in this part of the world.
Here.
Thank you for having me again.
Well, we're delighted to have you. And again, thank you for finding at least some reason to be hopeful. Great to have you. Next week, there will be a well-known Canadian-American political commentator. That's David Frum. He'll be in conversation with Pat Morrison. They'll talk about America's democracy. Where do we go from here? Thank you all very much for being with us tonight, and have a good day.